I'm Beryl. This is my co-pilot, Julianne. I guess. Which is there'll be a quiz later. But, so, Mecha Mythology, we're going to be talking about three major topics. If you're a veteran of the giant robot fandom, a lot of this will be familiar to you, but hopefully a little new information about some of the myths where those terms originated. Is anyone the friend that got dragged along? No idea. Really just here for we thank you for joining us anyway. Hopefully, if you learn even one new thing you didn't know before, we've accomplished our goal. So, we're going to cover terminology, how do we talk about the genre, where those terms come from, and how they've changed over time. We're then going to talk about the mythology, where giant robots come from in ancient legends, and tropes. So those unique twists in the narratives that giant robots can sometimes bring to life a little better than other weaponry. Now, before sinking into the meat of it, I'd like to start with a quote from a podcast called Friends at the Table. It's a gaming podcast similar to Critical Role and the like. They play Dungeons & Dragons, among other things, and they did a mecha narrative. And they said, sometimes you look up at them and think they could have made them look like anything, but we made them look like us. And that's exactly what we want to get to the root of today. We like stories that involve swords and shields, but not just swords and shields, not just armor, but giant robots, not regular robots. And that means something. That means something to the stories and how we experience them and how it makes them different. So, terminology. If you are at all familiar with the genre, you may know many of these. Let's talk about how we talk about giant robots. So science fiction gives us a lot of the terms to describe those. Of those, who thinks they know which of these was the first one used to describe what we now call a robot? Yes. Take a guess.
Machine, I would say.
You're close. Go for it.
Automaton.
Correct. Machine is number 2, so you're very close. It is indeed automaton. So automaton is the first in chronological order. And if you split this word, you get auto for self and matos for thought, something that thinks and acts of its own will. Those two words are Greek in origin, which is important because it first appears in the Iliad, a tome of Greek literature and mythology. Now, there are other examples within the Iliad that we'll talk about a little later for giant robots, but we understand the origin of this was actually used to refer to a sliding door. Very exciting. What does the word mean today? Now, it's important to note before we define these that these terms are flexible. If you asked someone to define these terms even 50 years ago, they would have been totally different. And if you disagree with how I'm defining any of these, totally fine. That's how the genre is evolving. So the first current definition we have is Merriam-Webster here in the United States, defines it as a mechanism that is relatively self-operating, especially a robot, not just a robot. It's important to note that we can use these to describe things that are not robots. And that'll become more important as we go through examples of the genre. If we cross the ocean to the Oxford English Dictionary, we get a moving mechanical device made in imitation of a human being. That's incredibly more specific and a little more of that we made them look like us flavor. So just to show you that if the two most popular dictionaries in the world can't agree on this, there should be no surprise that some of us in this room may disagree on how we define our giant robots. So automaton is the first term in our chronology, and as our friend here has said, the second term is indeed machine. So this also comes from Greek ultimately, but it starts with the Middle French, meaning device or contrivance. So it starts to get more general as you go back in time, coming from the Latin, machina or machina for trick or instrument. And then if you want to get even more sideways, you can go back to the ancient Greek and you get to cunning, or something that may just enable power. The next term to emerge, we have a third term to come from ancient Greek language. Does anyone have any guesses on which of these words come from the ancient Greek for rudder?
I'm just taking a guess. Android?
No. Android's actually quite recent. The ancient Greek for rudder is the origin of the term pilot, but we'll get to Android. So pilot also comes from Middle French, which means one who steers a ship. And that can come from the Italian piloto, and you go back even further, Old Italian pedotto, and then you go back to medieval Greek, and you get pedotes, meaning helmsman. Even further back, to ancient Greek once again, you get steering oar. I bring this up because the connection to the nautical is something that will come up again in the history of the giant robot genre. Now, do we have any guesses into what other word of our genre has a nautical connection? Go for it.
I want to say real.
Real does not. Real is actually a romance origin.
Oh.
Good. Yeah, go for it.
Cockpit.
Cockpit is correct. Cockpit is another word from Europe first. So obviously the first origin, cockpit, is from chickens fighting. But if you go back further, you get to coxswain, which is from the English term for a cockboat or a small vessel like a rowing boat, swain, which is a Norse term for boy. So it literally means boat servant. Which is something to keep in mind as we get to the pilots in our stories are often young boys. And now, the first word that precedes robot here, of course, is the last one chronologically before we get to the meat of it, is android. Now, android, once again, comes from the ancient Greek ander, meaning man, and oid, meaning looks like, or to be likeness of. So we get something that looks like a man, which you'll notice is in the automaton definition, and once we get to the definition of robot, we see that again. And a fun fact you can share with your friends, technically, the female version of an android is a gynoid. Yeah, so share that one for trivia night. So now we get to the big guns. Now it's important to know, right, as time goes on, these terms get more and more specific. So robot. How has the word robot evolved? Does anyone know what language the word robot comes from? Never mind, we'll just carry on. No worries. Any guesses on the region of what that language might be? No worries. So the word robot comes from robota, which is a Czech word, meaning servant. Servitude, slavery, drudgery, and a general connotation of very dirty hard work. So this is more along the early lines of the definition of android, a mechanical AI used to describe a human's work to do for them. So it must be different from the automaton powered by the self. And this is how it's used in its origin story, which is a Czech play called Rossum's Universal Robots. Came out in the 20s. So we're already in the 20th century by the time we get to the word robot. So I'll say spoiler alert, it's almost 100 years old. I think we're safe. The robots in the story outgrew that definition of servant by the end of the play. It's about a factory that makes artificial people, and the robots are set up to do humans' dirty work. They eventually rise up, rebel, and destroy the human race, as you do. And not only does the definition evolve within the story, but also depending on where you look, we get different definitions even today. Once again, Merriam-Webster, we get a machine that looks like a human being and performs various complex tasks. This makes sense. We don't really use robot to refer to anything mechanical. Your computer can complete plenty of complex tasks, but we don't necessarily refer to it as a robot unless it has limbs of some kind, who's doing something more motion-related. OED gives us a machine capable of carrying out a complex series of actions automatically, so we still get a little of that automaton flavor on the other side of the Atlantic. So now we have our baseline, and we know what giant means. I think we're all on that same page, and we know what robot means. So with robot in the mix, we're in the 20th century, and the next words originated in Japan. Anyone guess which of the remaining white ones is Japan?
I guess super robot?
No, super robot's the youngest term on the board, but good guess, because it is still from Japan, but the next chronologically. So I'll give you, you're technically correct. It is Japan. Correct. So yes, both Mecha and Real Robot. Real Robot comes from it's the English descriptor on a game that we'll get to. So the next word to arrive on the scene is Mecha. It's something that we now consider synonymous with the genre, but we may not all agree on the size of the machine. We pretty much universally agree it includes things that a person is operating or piloting. So that was originally used in Japan to refer to anything mechanical at all, trains, planes, automobiles, and that didn't show up until the 50s. There's no particular date, it's just an era. Now, interestingly, in the dictionary department, Merriam-Webster doesn't have a definition at all. It doesn't even have a definition for mech. It's still a pretty young word, and it isn't really used in the United States outside of the anime fandom and some harder science fiction stories, and those also came out in the 50s. First, we have Galactic Patrol in 1950 and Starship Troopers in 1958. However, the OED definition has three important qualifiers that help us on our quest to define these. So we get a large size, armored, suggests combativeness, and typically controlled by a person riding inside the robot itself. Not just controlled by a person, but someone inside. So if we follow the logic of this definition, all three of these items are controlled by humans, but it's got to be a robot. And by the Merriam-Webster definition, it has to have some sort of limbs or kind of look like a person, so a car is out. It has to be armored, so Iron Man would still count, but it's got to be large, which leaves us with Gundam here, representing its genre. So now we've completed all of those important terms back into the more recent 20th century. We'll add the final two important terms here from the latter half, starting with super robot. Now, Wikipedia explains, my favorite definition, explains super robot as totally non-plausible in context. So, super robot is a story in which the robot is a fantastical element. One of a kind solution for a one of a kind situation. Deus ex machina. It's not clear when this term originated, but it gained prominence right around the start. Feel free, come here, sit down. It gained prominence right around the start of the modern era with a manga titled, anyone want to guess the very first Mecha manga? Go.
Tetsujin 28.
Bang on the money. Tetsujin 28 Go was released in the United States as Gigantor. This came in 1956. And the robot was created as a one-of-a-kind and remote-controlled by a small boy. And it was used remote control. Don't be confused by the gun in his hand in this image. Seems a little overkill to me. But how do you know if your robot is super? We've got a handy visual aid here. See if you can spot the giant robot in this image. That's pretty easy, right? So this, of course, is from the Iron Giant. The title robot fancies himself Superman. And he's not only one of a kind in the story, but it's a big surprise when he shows up. And just how super he is and why he exists is the entire driver of the story itself. But what about real robots? So the term real robot is now defined as a real giant robot explained by real-world physics, means, and culture. You'll see this in the stories that they try to justify why robots are necessary. And it's a much more utilitarian role. So real robot is the youngest addition to our giant robot vocabulary. Its earliest notable use was in 1995 on the box descriptions for Super Robot Wars 4, which is why I'll give you credit for saying this is Japanese in origin. It was a Japanese game. So that featured technically super robots of all kinds fighting, but this is where we get the term real robot. So let's play I Spy again, see if you can spot the giant robot now. So this is an image by Hajime Hitoki. So he's most famous for his Gundam designs, but this is actually for the second Patlabor movie. I know it's a small screen, but you guys can see the giant robots, the labors in between the tanks and the choppers, that kind of second line of defense there. Now we've got our four major terms. So once we've got this field to play on, you can see how much more we can get out of our narratives if we look at how these terms oppose each other. So we have automaton operating by themselves, mecha piloted by humans, we have super robots, it's a unique element Deus ex machina, and real robots, more utilitarian on the bottom. And we'll notice patterns emerge in what types of stories these tell. Oftentimes, as I said, Deus ex machina on the top left. You'll get piloted, chosen one type stories in the top right. You get utilitarian, RUR on the bottom right. And you'll get droids, usually falls into the bottom left, or something more repetitive. We'll also notice in the genre, we'll start to get a cycle moving as stories go through time. And we'll illustrate this with some of the ones in the past 2 centuries. So the first one on the top left is a story called The Steam House. It's a Jules Verne story from 1880. And that was about a mechanical automaton giant elephant that carted British tourists around during the Raj. If you move to the top right, you'll get to, if anybody name that image, top right. Damn straight. War of the Worlds was 1897, not far after. And then the bottom two, of course, are Rossum's Universal Robots, where we get the word robot in 1920. And they move from the bottom right to the bottom left over the course of that story. They become more sentient and automata by the end of it. So where did our stories really start? For that, we have to jump to the mythology. We'll look at some of the origins of how giant robots and their like inhabited our stories. So we go back to automaton, originating from a certain Greek work of literature we mentioned before, the Iliad. So that gives us one of the earliest examples of the giant robot, and while it's not referred to as an automaton, for those of you familiar with the Greek gods will be familiar with Hephaestus. He's the god of the forge. I see some nodding. He created many automata, including such smash hits as the giant golden eagle that tortures Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods. And on the other end of the spectrum, he built golden tripod tables that roved around Olympus and served the gods. We'll come back to those tables later. I can hear you saying, Beryl, hurry up and get to the giant robots. Here we go. All right. Greek mythology. Zeus. Everybody familiar with Greek mythology knows Zeus really got around. Really a bit of a ladies and gentleman. So he transformed himself into a tame white bull to get the attention of Europa, who's the woman sitting on the back of said bull in this image. He got her to get on top of him as a bull, jumped into the sea, and swam across to the island of Crete, where he then had some fun with her. He then revealed his true identity and made Europa the queen of the island of Crete. And Hephaestus, in between creating moving tables and giant eagles, built a huge warrior that Zeus then gave to Europa to defend her from anyone else. Does anyone know the name of this giant bronze creature? Correct. So Talos is a giant bronze automaton. So his duties included circling the island of Crete 3 times a day. He would drive off intruders by throwing rocks at attacking ships or superheating his body in a fire and then hugging people to death. Very warm and fuzzy. So he was kept alive by a single vein of ichor that flowed through his body, stoppered up with a stud or some kind of nail, generally in the heel. But what did Talos do for the story? Is anyone familiar with Jason and the Argonauts? I see some nodding in the back. See, you are in the right panel. So Jason and the Argonauts are some heroes from Greek mythology, and they arrived on the island of Crete after having obtained the Golden Fleece, which is a sort of Holy Grail type object in Greek mythology, and Talos tried to drive them away. This is an image from Ray Harryhausen's film in the 1960s, where it's stop motion animated. You can see the ship at his bottom, his left foot for scale. So he represents a self-propelled thing, a self-thinking machine acting of its own will. He's the perfect example of an automaton. But he also represented the origin of the giant mechanical creature as an enemy. He's a villain, typically in the versions of the story. So not 10 years after this film came out, Talos showed up again in what's agreed on at the start of the Mecha genre in another manga. Does anyone remember the manga that the Talos wrote? It's Mazinger Z. So Mazinger Z came out very soon after, and that was a giant piloted mecha made of super alloy Z by a professor, as per usual, as a secret weapon to fight evil. So much of this story represents Greek mythology. There's a reference to the Mycene Empire, cleverly disguised in the manga as the Mycene Empire, who exists on an island. And on this island, they discover giant steel mechanical beasts called the Talos. So the manga shows us here the piloted Mazinger and the automaton Talos, a giant robot as protector and a villainous automaton as a thing to be defeated. So this is very common in early giant robot stories. The automaton is the villain. We see another example in Ogun Bat. Ogun Bat is the very first Japanese superhero. He came before Superman by about 20 years, and he's the golden figure in the front. So you'll notice behind him, one of his chief enemies is a giant robot with cat ears and claws for hands. So we see this repeating all the time in giant robots. In addition to this, Talos also gave us the start of several other giant robot tropes, including distinguishing what he was made of, how he was powered, and what he represented in the story. So he was, as we've said, made of bronze, and it's important to note that the myth, the entire Talos and Crete myth, originated on the island that it's talking about, and Crete itself was famous for its advancements during the Bronze Age. So unsurprisingly, they wanted to show off a bit and made a myth about it. No coincidence there. So this is something we see in our giant robot stories, often representing something in the culture that's the current technological obsession. This often manifests in what powers our robots. I'm talking about power. In Jason and the Argonauts, Talos was powered by the blood of the gods. And here you can see it being let out of his heel by one of the heroes. Again, this is from the Ray Harryhausen film. But in other versions of the myth, he was also powered by the ideals of the Cretan people. So he was considered the villain of the story, but he was envisioned by the Cretans as a protector. In some versions, he carried a copy of their laws around on a tablet. In other versions, he's not a gift from Zeus at all, and is simply the emerged personification of the island itself. So these 3 principles show up again at the very start of the mecha genre. We'll look at a particular example in Getter Robot. So this was a spiritual successor to Mazinger Z that came out just a few years after, and featured 3 combining mechs that were embodiment of teamwork and character development, something that was very new to giant robots. So what was it powered by? We look at Getter Rays. Now, according to the Getter Wiki, Getter Rays appear harmless, but can overload or a massive amount can cause large-scale destruction that can destroy an entire city and the lives within it. Because of this, measures have to be taken to prevent further catastrophes, such as stopping research until threats that could be dealt with Getter rays have surfaced. So why is this description important? Well, it was released in 1974, and the same time nuclear power was rising to prominence. The US and Russia were conducting tests throughout the 60s, and they were not producing nuclear power for commercial use, but it was the latest energy hot topic in the world, including Japan. So at the end of the series, it's confirmed that these Getter rays represent the spirit of evolution, specifically the evolution the human race had to go through to defeat the monsters in the story. So we'll look at some other quick precursors to some giant robot villains we might be familiar with. And remember those three-legged tables I was talking about? Did anyone name another villainous mechanical monstrosity with 3 legs? We saw an image of it already. One more time. The War of the Worlds. So, of course... Oh, I am missing the... There it is. So, War of the Worlds, of course, we get the tripods. They're often used as villains because technically tripedal motion is not physically possible. We'll see it animated, but it's not actually something that can happen physically. These, in turn, would inspire such things as... There we go. The AT-AT walkers from Star Wars. But we also see it in the anime genre frequently. We get Space Runaway Idion, where they show up. This is one of the other series by Yoshiyuki Tomino, who created Gundam, a much darker show. But we get tripods in that. We also get them in Pat Labor. And if anyone has any other examples, log those away. I'd love to add to this one. Go.
Not anime, but the Striders in Half-Life 2. Those are 3-legged big monstrosities.
Are they villainous?
Yes, they are.
There you go. So we see that common thread. I'm going to add that to the sheets we have here. We'll get to the end. So, the next one, we stay in Greek mythology and we get to the Trojan horse. This, of course, I get one chuckle every time. I love it. This is not the Trojan horse. This is an image from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where they made a large wooden rabbit, and it worked out so well. This, of course, is the Trojan horse. This is an image from the film Troy in 2004. So according to, once again, still in the Iliad, that word automaton and the tripod tables came from that story. We also get this story. So the Trojan War went on for 11 years, and the Greek forces decided, after 11 years, they decided to try something totally new, and they built a huge wooden horse, filled it with fighters, left it at the gates of the city of Troy, and sailed away. In the middle of the night, the Trojans said, "Yay, we won!" Dragged the horse into the city, had a fantastic party. The soldiers got out of the horse, unlocked the gates of the city, let back in the Greek army that had sailed back under cover of night. They sacked the city and won the war. Now, the Trojan horse is not a robot, or even an automaton, technically, and most historians agree it wasn't even a horse. It was likely a battering ram or a siege engine of some kind. But it represents a major start to larger-than-life artificial creatures controlled by humans. So what we have to remember is it didn't come into play until they'd been fighting for 11 years already. Again, this is Deus Ex Machina, but we're getting to the right side. We're getting to the human-piloted side of that. We see this idea of larger-than-life weapons to defeat enemies. Now, before everybody starts screaming Zoids, the important thing to remember about Zoids is in the original battle stories, they're actually wild animals that have to be tamed in order to be piloted. This is also the same for Voltron. So a more pure example would be Mechagodzilla. In the original film, Mechagodzilla was an extraterrestrial imposter, which Godzilla stopped, an automaton. And in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, it was something humans created by building over the bones of the dead Godzilla. So we've got a huge creature we can't defeat. What did we do? We built a giant creature of our own. Now we see, if all else fails, this is a very common storytelling trope, when all else fails, giant robot. And we see this even in stories that don't involve robots otherwise, such as pretty much every single episode of Power Rangers, the Powerpuff Girls, we've got Gravity Falls again, and The Legend of Korra, and I would be remiss if I did not mention Spaceballs. Again, any other examples, please let me know at the end. So Greek mythology, we've got Super Automaton and Super Mecha. Woo! And now, to get to our mythological orients of more on the real side, let's jump to Norse and Hebrew mythology. So here we get the idea of golems. Now, golems show up in pretty much every type of mythology across the world, but the two examples here are particularly giant robot related. We'll start with Hebrew mythology. So golems in Hebrew mythology were typically controlled by, made of clay and controlled by prayers that were written on them or in paper in their mouths by regular humans. In particular, the golem of Chelm, a version from 1748, was described as growing larger and larger, and his creator removed the holy name from his mouth for fear that he would destroy the universe. Escalating size, no one will be surprised, is a very common thing in the giant robot genre. Here we see Gurren Lagann, the series finale, where they're standing on galaxies, representing many, many occurrences of this trope in the modern genre. So now let's have a look at what Norse mythology can do for giant robots. So Hrungnir, a frost giant, who are villainous people in Norse mythology, insulted Thor. You can see that altercation happening on the left. Hrungnir kind of is the one splaying back, and he started threatening Thor one day that he was going to sink Asgard and abduct Freya, the goddess of the hunt, and steal his wife, and just your mother, and all of this trash-talking in general. And then he thought, crap, I'm insulting Thor, I should probably back myself up. And he built himself a golem named Muckerkalfi, who's the gray figure in this image on the right. So Muckerkalfi is, his name, translates as Miscalf. And he was created by the Frost Giant to defeat Thor. He was said to be 27 miles high, and his life force came from the heart of a horse. So again, spoiler alert, Thor defeated it, killed the Frost Giant, end of story. Both of these myths from Hebrew and Norse mythology, those automatons are being created by non-godlike creatures, something to do our dirty work and fight our battles for us. So where do we see this in the 20th century giant robot franchise? Does anyone remember this guy? Do you remember his name?
No, but...
No worries, but you got him.
Yeah.
Name?
Finster.
Finster is correct. I believe you. Tip of the tongue. Tip of the tongue. It is indeed, of course, Finster from the Power Rangers. So this is from the original Mighty Morphin. Now, we think giant robots, we think Power Rangers, we think Megazord, of course. But Finster also created the kaiju that they fight in the series by carving them out of clay, as you can see him doing here, and baking them in the monster-making machine that can be seen behind him. So he represents just one of the many examples of villains creating repeat enemies, including the putties from the series. They were baked like cookies, and the Power Rangers, of course, will defeat them inevitably. But an important connection there. So, I can hear you saying, Beryl, it's not mechanical, it's barely even giant. All right, fine. You want mass-produced mechanical weapons? Let's go to Catholic and Buddhist mythology. The same automata actually appear in both, so we see an early example of the crossover here. According to the Lokapanati, which is a collection of Pali tales, ancient mechanical contraptions were being created in the Kingdom of Rome. And these were called Bhuta Vahana Yanta, or spirit-moving machines, and they were constructed for many purposes. Some could fly, some could perform menial tasks, but most famously they were used to behead dissenters to the state. And we don't have an image of these from the original myth or the contemporary time period, so when I think flying beheading entity, I think P-hat, so that's what we're going with. Now, these were being created in the Kingdom of Rome. See if you can stay with me here. So the Romans wanted to keep the secret of these machines from getting out and letting them getting constructed anywhere. They had all the engineers sign a book, and if any of them went missing from Rome, the flying machine would be dispatched, and they would be beheaded. Meanwhile, in Burma, a Burmese guy found out about these and arranged to have himself reborn in the Kingdom of Rome. He does so, and he marries the daughter of one of the chief engineers. She gives him the secrets. She gives him the secrets of the construction of those robots, and he writes them down, puts them on a leaflet, and sews it into the flesh of his own leg. He then tells his son that I'm going to try to leave the city, I'm going to behead me, I need you to take my body back to Burma. And that is exactly what happens. He is beheaded, his son takes his body back to Burma, his thigh is opened, and the blueprints are retrieved, and they then use them to create many more that are either used, depending on myth, to either defend King Ashka, who's a very famous figure in Buddhist mythology, and Hindu mythology, or they're used to guard the elixir of life, and they're believed to have had chainsaws for hands. Again, can't find a picture of this. If anybody finds one, please share it with me. So the important thing about this is this is a precursor to a trope we now call grand theft prototype. Very common in science fiction. Anytime there's technology, somebody's going to want to steal it. So it's the opening of Star Wars, I'm using as the example here, but I wanted to highlight this is particularly prevalent in giant robot fiction, which we'll come back to in a minute. But let's recap on mythology. again, you see our cycle completing. We've got Talos in the top right, starting at Automata. We've got a human piloted thing in the top right, moving down. We get a more utilitarian flying robot. And then on the left, a self-sufficient thinking utilitarian life form. And now, our third and final topic, tropes. So I wanted to cover some common storytelling tropes that have mythological starts or are more unique to the giant robot genre, or if they execute them better than other weapons in fiction. So let's first go back to Arthurian legend. So the idea of being worthy of your weapon. This is, of course, an image from The Sword and Stone, the animated feature from the early 90s. So he who pulls the sword from the stone is worthy of the king, worthy of God, and worthy of the kingdom. The sword trusts him, why shouldn't I? This is a trope we love so much, we've added it into other mythologies. Marvel Comics adds this inscription to Thor's hammer. Whoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. That's not a part of the original mythology. There's no mechanic for the hammer judging the user. We've added this aspect of the story to make the story richer and have the weapon help tell us something about our characters. Where do we see this in a giant robot genre? Think no further than the Big O. So throughout the show, this is an older one, the Big O's boot sequence includes this phrase, cast in the name of God, ye not guilty. Now, the first time I watched the Big O, I wasn't sure if it was judging the pilot. Was Roger being judged? Was it judging the enemy he's about to defeat? And it helps if you understand the backstory of where this came from. Does anyone happen to know where that inscription was inspired by? Anyone take a shot?
Sorry.
No worries. That's what we're here for.
I got nothing.
No worries. So we have to go back to Conan the Barbarian. Now, the series director for the Big O, Kazuyoshi Katayama, said this was taken from an inscription on Conan the Barbarian's sword, "Suffer no guilt, ye who wield this sword in the name of Crom." Now, all we have to do to get back to the original mythology is replace Crom with God, and we get to Christendom. So this is taken from the idea that executioners' swords had these inscriptions on them, and it was used to absolve the executioner of guilt and sometimes bless the executee with the idea that all souls would reach heaven safely. Love this trope in giant robots, because it reminds us and reassures us that our pilot is good or bad, and it also reminds us that the mecha, even in the service of good, can be a weapon for great destruction. As such, in the finale of the Big O, spoiler alert, in the finale of the Big O, the robot judges a pilot to be unworthy and grants him his wish of being one with the robot, which is be guilty, and eats him. Something that doesn't typically happen with a sword or a hammer. This trope can also help us illustrate the damage the robot can do to its pilot in other ways. We go to Gundam Wing from the 90s. Gundam Wing gives us the Zero system, something we see in other giant robot shows, but Gundam's a particular example. Connects pilot to data, allowing them faster reflexes and battle intelligence, makes them more like a machine. One of our protagonists, the blonde guy on the right, Katra, one of the good guys, gets overtaken by this, and because he has kind of unclear goals, it basically makes him see red, drives him crazy, and he destroys several space colonies and presumably millions of people before being stopped by one of our other protagonists, Hiro Yui, who becomes the eventual pilot, because he can handle the Zero system, he has clearer objectives, and presumably he's dead inside. Now, this is worse because Katra here is the nicest guy in the show, and it hurts a lot in the story to see him drop to such a low point, and it haunts him for the rest of the series. So the point I want to make to consider is, if it had been just a sword and a rock, or a hammer that you can't lift, instead it's a giant robot that you're trapped inside, and how that makes our stories different. So let's stick with Gundam and revisit the previous trope example here, Grand Theft Prototype. And what I want to highlight, this is particularly prevalent in science fiction because this trope used to be called the Gundam Jack. This is important because unlike Star Wars, we're not talking about stealing a thumb drive on plans. We're stealing an entire vehicle, a large weaponized vehicle, and the earliest real-life examples of this come from the days of piracy, where you would board enemy ships and run your own flag up. The earliest example of this in film we see is The Hunt for Red October. Sean Connery plays a Russian submariner who commandeers a Russian stealth submarine, and a lot of the story is him trying to reach the American government. Is he stealing it? Does he have good intentions? Is he trying to attack us? Or does he genuinely want to defect to the United States? And the fact that he's guiding and in control and inside a super-powered weapon, is a huge driver of the story. Why is this important to the Giant Robot franchise? It's a similar vein to the Giant Submarine. Gundam Jack is the name of the first episode of Gundam 0083 from the early 90s. The opening episode, Anavel Gato, one of the anti-heroes of the story, steals the Gundam Gonzalez at the beginning of the series. He waltzes into the Albion, steals a Federation uniform, Stormtrooper style, and jumps into the Gundam and cuts his way out of the ship. So you can see him masquerading on the left here in the truck, getting into the base, and on the right, cutting his way out of the hull. Again, consider this with kind of any other weapon or vehicle. And the other benefit we get from these types of stories in our Giant Robot thing is instant gratification. Oftentimes, if you're stealing plans, you have to get somewhere safe, and there's encryption, and you have to decode them. Stealing weapon means you can fight immediately. And sometimes maybe the robot doesn't work, and creates more drama there. Here, an example from Transformers Prime, we have the Apex armor, which is, previously in the series, we had only seen this armor being used by other Transformers and giant robots. Here we see it being used. Miko, a human, steps on this button, and the armor encases her in a giant mech suit, and it works. So here we can see her taking the piss out of one of the drones of the Decepticon army, and she kicks the ass of Starscream. So we see this again also in the opening of Gurren Lagann. It's a very popular opening trope for Gundam series because we have an excellent way to demonstrate someone's brass balls, demonstrate the capabilities of the robot, and some of the parameters of the story of the forces fighting. So again, you get a little bit of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods here. He steals the Ganmen at the beginning of the series and inspires everyone else to steal their own and start the team that completes the show. A more villainous example, we go to Evangelion, and we get the alien angel fungus Bardiel that takes over Unit 3?
Unit 3.
Unit 3, thank you. Unit 3, and with Evangelion, we've reached the end of our cycle once again. We get Ogun Bat, one of the very first giant robot starts. We got Gigantor Tetsujin 28 Go in the top right. Moving down to the real robots, Gundam shows up in the 70s. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I thought it was time. Gundam, and then moving over to Ava in what one of my favorite articles describes as the postmodernism of giant robots in the bottom right. Because we get, spoiler alert, Ava's, they get a little bit sentient towards the end there, moving over to the automaton side. Also Mechagodzilla, as I said before, the first Mechagodzilla on the top left, moving over to human-piloted in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 on the top right. The Transformers franchise fills this entire cycle by itself. Starting on the bottom right, the original toys were piloted. And then moving over into Cybertronian society in the early stories, on the bottom left, they become real and it's their own society. There's nothing super about them. Then they come to Earth and they become super in the top left. And then finally, by the end of pretty much any Transformers story that involves humans, they're trying to create their own Transformers, or in the case of Master Force, they just become them. So here we saw Transformers Prime, Silas taking over Breakdown. So that brings us to the end of the mythological portion. I will pass it over to my co-pilot here to talk a little bit about cockpit design.
Okay. See you over there, sorry.
I'll switch with it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah. All right. So, cockpit design. So, in the same vein as tropes, or as Beryl was talking about tropes and how there are external factors that affect the story and the way that the machines affect the stories, cockpit design and robot design is a very big part of that. So, specifically, I want to talk to you guys today about the pilot position, and this is more specifically about how the pilots are sitting within the cockpit itself. And so there are three major types that I want to go over, and they are in the form of every theater kid's favorite warm-up game: sitting, standing, and lying down. So we'll start with a sitting cockpit, and this is the most common style that's seen throughout Gundam. If you think of any Mecha series, chances are the pilot is sitting down inside of their robot, and it's derived from mechas being used, or being equated rather, with machines. Machines being fighter jets and cars, and anything that you can get behind the wheel of and drive in a way. So, using fighter jets as a specific example, this is a very common option throughout the Gundam universe. It's actually an in-canon sort of design decision that they made. And it's because most of the Gundam series have very heavy war tones throughout them. So on the left you have an actual fighter jet cockpit, and on the right we have a Moro Ray from also Gundam, and you can sort of see the similarities between them. And yeah, just the fighter jet being directly equated with war, but this doesn't necessarily mean that having a sitting cockpit means that your story is going to be about war. So taking a look at a show like Pat Labor, it's much more of a slice of life. And all of the mechas, or labors rather, in the series were created for more everyday use. The Ingrams specifically used as like a police car replacement enhancement. And yeah, it's a much lighter tone, it's a much more everyday, definitely not at war type of series. So the commonality between these two is that the robot is enhancing the actions of the pilot. And sitting is sort of an indication that they are still two separate entities that are working together to do one thing together. So a pilot is to a jet as a pilot is to a Gundam, a driver is to a car as Noah is to her Ingram. But of course there are exceptions, as with anything. Circling back to Gurren Lagann again, this absolutely breaks the sitting pilot model, because all of the robots, all of the characters are sitting in their gunmen. And there's technically a war going on, but the plot is much more about individuals overcoming an obstacle, about Shinron, Kamen and Yoko, and everyone just like escaping the world and, piercing the skies, getting into the universe and everything. But because this is Gynax and because everything is so action oriented, they took the method in which everyone is sitting is much more exaggerated in the way that the gunmen move and the way that they have expressions on their faces. It's very different from the typical sitting cockpit. So moving on to standing cockpits. These are much less common than a sitting cockpit, but they are typically used for stories that want to emphasize action. So sort of like Gurren Lagann, but standing up. First one that comes to mind, at least for me, is G Gundam. And so unlike most of the other Gundam series, G Gundam sort of rejects the plot of war and substitutes it with a tournament. And individuals are chosen to represent each country, and each of those individuals is also given a robot. And when you consider that the movements are the standing is synonymous with movement control, so like when you punch, the robot punches, when you kick, the robot kicks, etc., it gives you this correlation that the pilot is the robot and the robot is the pilot. So instead of the robot and the pilot being separate entities, it is just the same person/robot. And again, there is an exception. So if you take a look at Pacific Rim, for example, the Jaegers function much more like a typical robot with a sitting cockpit in the way that they are machines for their pilots rather than extensions of them. Because literally the pilot's brains are linked together, and their actions do become the actions of the Jaeger. But this is a more centric movie, and you're not necessarily seeing the two pilots as the robot itself. They're still two kind of separate entities in a way. But by setting up the cockpit in this manner, they're able to maintain the warlike plot, but also put a very heavy emphasis on the action in the movie, and that's super exciting. And moving on to our last one, lying down. And these are even fewer and farther between than the standing cockpits. So first and foremost, we have sort of in the militaristic vein, the gun snipers from Zoids. So they work just the same as every other Zoid in the series, except that you can also snipe out their tails. So the pilot is inside sitting in their cockpit, but they can recline their seat, flip over, and then all of a sudden they have a sniper gun that is the length of the tail over here. Another example that you guys might know is from Darling in the Franxx. What can I say other than this is just sort of inherently sexual?
Propaganda.
What?
Sensual propaganda paid for by the Abe government.
But between the butt controls and just this, what else could it be? So, surprisingly, there is a correlation between these two, whether it seems likely or not. And that's okay. It's less to do with the relationship of the pilot and the mecha, and it has to do more with this vulnerability of the pilot. So the Zoids, when they're in sniper mode and the pilot is flipped over, they're completely away from their other set of controls, and they can't defend themselves otherwise. So when the gun snipers showed up in the show, the protagonists eventually took them out while the pilot was in the sniper mode. And in Darling in the Franxx, the vulnerability comes from the lady's dependency on the guys to protect them, because the women are the batteries for the robot, and it's just, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, those are three of the aspects of some design and how they affect the stories as we see them today.
That's the end of the meat of it. I usually end with a little fun game. My mother asked me questions when I told her she was doing this panel, and we addressed such wonderful, important questions as, does this count? And one of the first ones I got was Howl's Moving Castle. So, technically, it has limbs, that Merriam-Webster definition of looking like a person. It does have an anthropomorphic quality. However, it's not really used in a combative fashion in the show. Some of the maybe upper portals look like they could potentially be cannons, but in the original book, the castle just slides along the ground. Yeah.
It's more akin to something like, say, a ziggurat, if that makes any sense. A ziggurat being an armored fortress.
Yes, exactly. And the same way we equated this in the discussion of, like, right, the Death Star doesn't count as a giant robot. In similar way. Yeah.
It also kind of reminds me of the summon Alexander from Final Fantasy.
Yes. Yeah. You get a lot of those, yeah. All of that category. In that same way, it's like, right, it's a giant combative armored thing, but not quite what we think of when we think giant robot. The one other example, just more recently, Mortal Engines. If anybody's seen the movie or read the novel, I would say maybe, depending on the design of the city, they are very tank-like. If anybody's not familiar with Mortal Engines, it's a story where giant mechanical cities, basically the cities of Europe, have been placed on mobile apparatuses, and they eat other cities, which is pretty cool. But they are just kind of moving around on treads. None of them have limbs per se. Some of them may be more of the articulated ones, I would say. Yeah, right, I'd call them a giant robot. But, yeah, again, it's like, open to interpretation. The terms we've gone on are all flexible. So that's about it. We're done very good on time. I talked fast enough. Thank you. I've added some slides this time around, so I was concerned. But we usually like to end with any questions you guys have, or if there's any examples you've thought of that we didn't mention. We'd love for you to come up and share them with us. Write them down on one of these slips here and add them to one of our charts. And just let us know what you thought.
Thank you so much for
joining us. Yeah, we've got the Real Robot Show